quarantine.
Most of you guys have been on this panel before. For people who haven't seen this panel before, we're talking about the storytelling apparatus similarities between professional wrestling and comic books. Joining us on the panel today as an esteemed, look at this panel that we have here. Let's go. I don't know what order you guys are in because this is the first one of these I've hosted. But why don't we go down the line, starting with Anthony Bench. Introduce yourself and put yourself over a little bit.
Okay. My name is Anthony Bench, and I am a writer and podcast producer and sometimes host of podcasts. Right now, I'm working on the So Fast, So Furious podcast, where we look at the Fast and the Furious movies 15 minutes at a time, which is really strange because I've never seen them before. Yeah, and that's me. Move along.
Flobo Boyce.
Yeah, I was funny you said that because I also do a Fast and Furious podcast called Entertainment Still Presents the Cast and the Furious, and we were looking up if there's other Fast and Furious podcasts, and we saw yours, and we're like, dang, So hello everyone, Flobo Boyce here, comic book writer, and in a very, very unique period of time in my life, but currently I am the Monday Night Raw and NXT after show host over at AfterBuzz TV. I love talking about tights and wrestling and drop toe holds and all that stuff.
I keep bringing Flobo back on the panel because every time we do, he's just a little bit more famous. Just a little bit more famous. A little bit more famous. I'm waiting to get to see the drop-off point where he's no longer willing to do this panel.
Next year. Yeah.
He'll
Rik
come back after
Offenberger.
WWE fires him.
I'm Rik Offenberger. I'm working on First Comics News and G-Man Comics currently. I was the public relations coordinator for Archie Comics for 10 years. I met Josh through wrestling and been a lifelong fan. But I talk more about how comics and storytelling relate with wrestling storytelling than actual personal experience with wrestling.
Robert Samo.
Hi, I'm Robert Samo, also known as RC Samo, founder of Fanboy Nation and Fangirl Nation. I met Josh through mutual friends that didn't tell us we both were into wrestling. I used to do the APW newsletter when I was in college, and then Josh and I worked together at Mach 1 Wrestling and Championship Wrestling from Hollywood for a while. I just interviewed Sonya Deville, so that's she wants to be Batwoman, so that's going to be a fun topic to discuss at some point.
Oh.
Francis Szyskowski, or Francis Sky.
Yep, Francis Sky Szyskowski, everyone to call me. I am a reporter for First Comics News, also working on a independent comic with Josh himself called The Massacre Twins. That we're working on, and it's got things going. Also, Flobo, quick question though. Since you're doing all this, getting more famous and working in Raw and NXT, is Bruce Pritchard going to take your job too?
Yeah, pretty much. Why not?
One guy's job who Bruce Pritchard wouldn't want to take, because if there's one job where he would be working harder than he is right now, it's if he was this guy, Michael Kingston.
Hey guys, how you doing? Mike Kingston. I'm the writer and creator of Headlocked Comics. In the midst of a Kickstarter as we speak for our new book, and still pumping out content. So yeah, life hasn't really changed so much.
Still working, still grinding, even through a pandemic. So also Scott Lost, who former 10-year plus professional wrestler, co-founder of PWG. He's usually on this panel with us, but wasn't able to join us. So we're sporting the Accidental Aliens Read Independent Comics t-shirt on his behalf. So go check out the Second Shift comic book at Scott Lost Art. All right, so two of my biggest passions as far as storytelling since I was a kid were pro wrestling and comics. And it occurred to me many years ago that there's a huge crossover, not just in fan base, but in how these unique forms of storytelling are created. There's levels of storytelling that build upon each other in order to create the stories that we follow. In the comics, we have each panel on a page which tells its own story. Several panels on a page tell a whole story from the beginning of the page to the end of the page. Each page then a single story in a single comic book. Several comic books making an arc, etc., being very much like watching a pro wrestling match where there's a storyline arc, many matches that take part in this arc, and then each show in and of itself has to be a contained story that you're able to follow for people that jump on new, and even each match having its own story just inside of that one match, the moves that are put in order in a certain way in order to evoke an emotion. Starting down the line, what was your earliest pro wrestling and also your earliest comic book moment that captured you, whether it was because of character, because of just a gripping storyline, because of a cover, because of pomp and circumstance, a moment, the moment that in pro wrestling and in comic books captured your imagination, starting with Michael Kingston. Oh,
I think it's frozen.
I
It's
think
frozen. For the bell. I'm sorry. I was saying
Flobo, go for it.
I don't remember a specific wrestling moment because it's always been a part of my life. The WWF home territory is New York City, so like it's been there my entire. My dad came to this country and he always said, I always tell the story every year, but when he went to go see his favorite wrestler at the time, Chief Jay Strongbow, he felt more like an American because it didn't matter who you were in the stands at MSG, you're all cheering for Chief Jay Strongbow. But for comics, the thing is, I liked to read, but not my book work for school. And so my tutor at the time gave me my first Archie comic as a way to keep me interested in reading. So my comic book moment was actually Jughead. Jughead Jones was a guy who was simple, just loved his cheeseburgers, and didn't understand why Archie was always getting into trouble. And I thought that was perfectly me at that age because I was a fat kid.
How about Rik Offenberger?
With wrestling, when I was very, very little, I was at my grandmother's house, and wrestling was on one of those UHF stations that you couldn't get real good reception with. And a little guy jumped out of the ring as an enormous man chased after him. And I looked at my mother and asked her, "What is this?" And she said, "That's just what wrestling is." And I couldn't understand why the little guy would get in the match with the big guy if he was going to run away. And then we left my grandmother's house, and I could never find it again because we didn't get that station where we lived. And I didn't actually get to see wrestling until I was in high school. And the first match my brother and I saw was the Tonga Kid. And it was just amazing. I mean, as he's flying everywhere, jumping off the corner turnbuckle. I mean, it was just amazing. And then the next week, we see Hulk Hogan win the title from the Iron Sheik, and we were hooked. And the whole first round they had with Roddy Piper and Hulk Hogan was probably my favorite arc ever because it was my first.
Oh, nice.
With comics, you know, I had started with the Batman TV show. I'd seen the Superman, Batman, and Aquaman hour in the mornings when I was a kid. And then on Sunday, after Sunday school, my father would pick up a comic for me at 7-Eleven on my way home, a Slurpee and a comic. I didn't really identify with a specific character or a title until I found Teen Titans when I was, you know, and I really liked Kid Flash. And from that point on, I actually kept the comics and I saved them and, you know, read them over and over again and started what would be a comic collection.
Samo?
We'll go with the Iron Sheik. That was the first moment. And of course, you know, my parents being immigrants from the Middle East, my dad was hated professional wrestling because of him. You know, it's like, great, we had a revolution in Iran, and now we get stuck with this guy spitting on the American flag every chance he gets. But for me, what really got me into professional wrestling was definitely the Road Warriors, just because they were superhuman. I mean, they came out with the spikes and the leather and the weirdo haircuts and face paint and everything else. And I remember one instance where they were going to do the scaffold match back in 86 or 87. and just Hawk is taking pumpkins and just throwing them off the scaffold because he wrote everybody's name on them. So I thought that was hilarious.
Because
Yeah. And then with comics, it started with the Super Friends cartoons, but the book that really hit, I think the first one that I actually ever read was Crisis on Infinite Earths. And I'm like, if you're going to get started with comics, that's going to be the biggie.
yeah,
Still is the
not a
best
bad one to start
crossover
with.
ever.
I started with Archie digests off of off the check stand at Albertsons. You started off with like one of the biggest storylines in all of comics. So yeah, Francis.
Yes. Oh, hi. For me, for wrestling was kind of wrestling and comics is kind of the same kind of start. It was almost like it was always there. You know, there was always there in the background. You know, started up like everybody else, Batman, Superman, all that kind of stuff, Super Friends. But then what really, for some reason, clicked with me was during my angsty teenage years was The Crow from J.O. Barr. I saw the movie first, and I got into that, and then just started reading the art. I finally picked up the graphic novel, the artistic style, I don't know how to say it, but just everything about it was just cling to me for some reason. And then, hence came the gothy phase, and you see me go through and everything, Josh. But also for wrestling, it was same thing, kind of just there. Always knew about Hulk Hogan, Roddy Piper, knew about the characters, Ricky Steamboat. And then for some reason, just one night, I would watch it casually, but then one night my dad was the main event, and he said, "Hey, want to watch this? Has the boss, Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage against Akeem and Big Boss Man. Want to watch it?" I'm like, okay. And so my first big angle was the Mega Powers Explode, which was, of course, one of the best, most, how do you put it? The best slow builds you've ever seen is the Mega Powers Explode.
Yeah, that was my first angle too. Anthony?
So my first exposure to wrestling was my next door neighbors. They were an elderly couple, and the neighbor, I called him Poppy. He was really into wrestling from way back in the day. I was watching Hulk Hogan versus Ultimate Warrior, and somehow my brain put together that Hogan was the good guy and Ultimate Warrior was the bad guy. And I remember watching Ultimate Warrior win, and that just blew my mind and made me feel dread and despair for the first time. It was really traumatic. It was. As far as comics go, just a similar story. I had a babysitter who had a son who was a few years older than me, and he was really into comics, everything from mostly Marvel, X-Men, Spider-Man, stuff like that. And I remember him showing me the Infinity Gauntlet stuff. I must have been 6 years old. I wanted desperately to know what the characters were saying to each other, so that kind of, I guess, kickstarted my interest in learning how to read. And I mean, within a couple of months, I was reading fairly good for my age. The moment I put them together was when years later, because I kind of had this large gap between my wrestling watching, was when I was watching the Ministry of Darkness, or the Ministry of Evil. Hey, what was it? The Undertaker.
Darkness.
Yeah, the Ministry of Darkness. And I'm watching them, well, crap, that's the Legion of Doom. That's the most cartoony comic book thing I've ever seen. Is a group of evil bad guys join up and taking on the good guys. Yeah, I've been watching wrestling and reading comic books ever since. It's been a while.
And Michael Kingston, glad you were able to get back into the room.
Yeah, for me it was George the Animal Steele that got me into wrestling. The very first Saturday Night's Main Event, flipping channels, and you can tell I'm old because I'm flipping channels on the box that's attached to the TV, not a remote. But flipping channels, and we get to Saturday Night Live is usually on, and all of a sudden Saturday Night's Main Event is there, and I have no idea what it was, and I just happened to turn it on when George the Animal Steel had made his was in the middle of his turnbuckle chewing, and it totally captivated me. I'd never seen anything like it, and it's been with me ever since. For comics, and I don't know where my first introduction to sort of the characters were, because they always existed. Like, I had this card game. It was like Old Maid with like superheroes on it, and like if you lost, if you got Dr. Doom, like he was the Old Maid. So like I had that, and like Spider-Man was on the Electric Company, so like I had some sort of passing knowledge of characters, but like it wasn't until I think I was at the supermarket or drugstore or something. There was a spinner rack, and there was an issue of Spider-Man where he's fighting Captain America on the front, and like I knew in my head that they were both good guys, and I was intrigued as to why these two guys would be fighting each other. So I made my mom buy it for me, and then I had sort of a casual I'd pick up comics at the store and stuff, and then eventually my mom took me to a comic book store, and that was like the coolest thing ever. You're like, oh my God. I still remember like the first time walking into a legit comic book store, just all the comics and the comics on the walls, and you're just like, oh my God, it's like, Nirvana. So that was my introduction to comics, and I've been, I guess, stuck with them, through my whole life. I've never really had a period of my life. I stopped collecting comics when I was in college just because it was hard, but then I picked right back up when I got out. But we used to commandeer the lounge to watch Monday Night Raw, which would infuriate all the people who wanted to watch Melrose Place. But
You were doing them a favor.
Since we're promoting shirts, I just want to have the commemorative Shad Gaspard shirt here from Collar and Elbow that the proceeds all go to his family. So
yeah, I'm glad you.
Shad and I just collaborated on a book right before he passed, and just love that dude.
Right before he passed, has that come out? Something that's already come out, or something that's coming out still?
It's going to be in this month's Wrestle Crate. Like, literally, I talked to him. Like, I got his final edits from him like 4 days before he passed.
Wow.
He started the comic about 2 years ago, and we did an interview with him for Assassin and Sons. And it's now coming out from Scout Comics. They've already solicited the first and second issue. So if you don't get Wrestle Crate, you can order it from your local comic shop. I'm assuming with the pause in shipping to Diamond, it'll be easy to still get that first issue ordered before it ships. And instead of a graphic novel, it will be done as a mini-series. I assume they'll follow up with a trade-sized graphic novel.
Well, mine's just we're just a Headlocked story we worked on together. It's not Assassin and Sons.
So, Mike, I'll ask you first, and then have Francis and Flobo follow up as people who have and are currently writing active comic storylines. You're several books deep now into Headlocked, and comics, to me, comics and wrestling was always a natural crossover. I mean, now you've looked at wrestlers in the ring, and it was fairly obvious to me that it was just comic book characters come to life. Comics, though, for a lot of years, treated, I don't know, there's this weird, comics and wrestling treated each other, the fan bases kind of treated each other like they were the weird ones. And comics as an industry, if ever you saw wrestling mentioned, it was in a weird, like, supernatural or holy terror, kind of like played for yucks. What was it story-wise and from a dramatic standpoint, a storytelling standpoint, that you felt compelling enough to bring the realistic aspect of the life of pro wrestling to the comic book medium? And why do you think that marriage has been so successful for you?
The thing that I liked the best, to me, it's sort of as art forms, they were so similar, but also as businesses, like aesthetics, they were very similar. Like, like I would watch wrestling, and then, you sort of discover independent wrestling. You're like, oh, it's not all WWE, and you read comics, and then like one day I discovered Preacher and Vertigo and then independent comics, and they're like, oh, it doesn't all have to be superheroes. And I thought just the dynamic of that as an art form, how they're both sort of dominated by these singular aesthetics, but like, you know, and people weren't even aware of like other ways that you could tell stories in the medium, I think was always fascinating to me. And part of it with wrestling too is like wrestling was so polarizing. Like you either love it or you hate it, and whether you've seen it before or not. You know, some people have never seen wrestling would instantly reflexively hate it. So my goal was to sort of tell a story that was entertaining, where, you know, we could learn the art of wrestling along with my main character, because he's a kid who's a fan who quit school, and it's this journey through the wrestling business. And, you know, sort of if you could follow him along, you might have more of an appreciation for what goes into it. Kind of hide the medicine in the food, so to speak. You know, in the same way that, you know, I'm sure there's a ton of people who watch Rocky but don't watch boxing on the reg, you know? So that was my sort of impetus to make Headlocked. And just, you know, you spend your whole life like just, and even now, like when you ask people like, what's a comic book movie? Like people don't think of like History of Violence or whatever, you know, or Ghost World, you know, it's, you know, superhero books. So it's, and sometimes there's, you know, movies that are superhero movies that never had a comic book that people are like, oh, it's a comic book movie. So just the idea of wrestling, you know, I kind of wanted to just sort of do away with the idea that wrestling meant WWE and that comic books meant superheroes. And I think that there's a lot of, you know, and beyond that, just anybody trying to get their dream, you know, like both comics and wrestling are wish fulfillment at their heart. And I think everybody that at some point or another wanted to be a wrestler. So I think you think like, I could do that. So we're putting people in that guy's shoes, because for, you know, obviously everybody doesn't go to wrestling school, and I can't affect people radioactively to give them a shot at being a superhero. So we had to do it this way.
If anybody watching this came upon this video because they were interested in wrestling comics and they haven't stumbled upon Headlocked yet, one of the things that I find most interesting about it, people find it like it's, you know, it's the brand new, like, oh, you know, every con I'm sure you have people stumble upon it like it's something that just came out. You've been grinding on this for like 15 years or so. So what came first, the desire and the idea that you wanted to write comics, or a familiarity and an attention towards the drama behind the scenes and the realities of independent professional wrestling, and then the idea of I should tell this story in sequential art?
I mean, the only thing I ever wanted to do was write comics. Like, I didn't want to write prose or anything. Like, I mean, if I got to the point where Headlocked isn't sustainable, I mean, because obviously comics are not cheap to make at all. And that's the hardest part of it, I think, is just the expense of paying 4 different people to work on it or whatever. Like, I don't think I'd want to write prose. It just, and I like to read, but it's just not something I want to write. So I enjoy writing comics, and I always wanted to write comics, and I guess I didn't necessarily have a story in my head. And then one day you know, wrestling, just the idea of wrestling, it just come to me, and I was like, oh, maybe this is what I'll do. And then it just sort of grew over time. And, you know, I mean, it's obviously, it's so much easier to break in now, but I mean, when I started in 2007, like, it just, there wasn't like a roadmap, and I didn't necessarily know how to do it. And so like I had a lot of time to let this all percolate in my mind and to work out ideas and stuff. So, I mean, some of the ideas that are just coming out, like volume 5 is our next book. Like some of the ideas in volume 5 were in my head 15 years ago. We're just getting there now. So
wow. That's funny how that works sometimes. Any aspiring writers out there, never throw anything away. You never know, we can repurpose it. Francis and Flobo, both of you are actually writing comics and have been involved in pro wrestling on different aspects. What about the psychology of storytelling, either or both, in how you're driving your narrative or how you're building interesting and compelling characters? Did you borrow from wrestling in the writing of the comics that you've made or are working on? Francis first.
I took, well, when we first started was just kind of like oh, let's do these little strips. This is cool. It's almost like a spot, like you'd have in a wrestling match. But then it's like, if you keep just doing that, it's kind of lose its energy, I guess you could say, or people just go numb to it. So instead, it's kind of doing like the method of making a match where you have your scene, like I'll have like specific scenes I want to do and say, you know what, we need to lead to that scene instead of just, here it is, you know, there makes no sense, but here you go. But this one, it has to have like, you know, you need to care about why they're doing it or why something has happened, which is almost not, I wouldn't say it's a lost art, but sometimes people just want to just jump right to it or, you know, have dessert before dinner kind of thing. So it took a little bit of discipline for me to do that, but it's a process, and, you know, you want to build and build and build where it gets exciting instead of having to just like, okay, they did this, so now I got to make this bigger, but why am I doing it?
Flobo?
Yeah, it's interesting that Mike said about the business of both comics and wrestling. If you go back to our American history, because they're both entertainment properties, are usually associated with children, their business health is usually tied to the world economy. When our country is doing well, so does comic book sales. Relatively speaking, of course, because it's on a giant decline in general. But so is wrestling as well. So that's interesting. I think it's a cool way to look at it. If you look at the down periods of wrestling and the big periods now, you know, we had a little bit of spikes of prosperity. Again, I use those words with quotations. But when it comes to the psychology of things, it seems like it's a big deal to writers now. About 20 years ago, there was a book that came out for screenwriters called Save the Cat. And Save the Cat basically told you that, hey, look, every couple pages, it has to be an incident or a reversal. And for screenwriters, it was like this, mind-blown emoji. But wrestling's been doing that as a live art form for as long as it's been done. You know, yeah, there's squash matches, but it wasn't so much of a build to an end. There was a build, and inside that build, there were reversals, times where your characters got beat, or you thought he had the winning of this argument, but then someone drops a mic on them. And comic books were always about that. You can blame it to the Marvel method, where there was only a certain number of panels, and story had to fit in these panels. But I think that gave us all a leg up when we came down to writing our characters and writing our stories about, hey, look, we've seen this live every Monday and Thursday night, or Wednesday if you're a Thunder person. Why not apply that to our work?
Well, what did you specifically, though, in Silverstreek and in Legacy?
Sure.
Was there anything that you borrowed, do you think, from having watched and soaked in pro wrestling storytelling since the time you were a kid? Did you borrow from that world at all to form your narrative or build out any of your character work?
Right. And Silverstreek is a superhero book. Silverstreek has a bit of an attitude and one of the better talkers, right? The Rock was really a big inspiration to that, being able to punch person in the face and make that quip, but do it in a way where you want to enjoy yourself. Legacy was about an archaeologist going into Mesoamerica, and a lot of things I drew from was actually John Cena, because here's somebody who's so smart and so powerful. I was worried about being her being too overpowering on the page, having those 3 moves of doom. So like, as much as I would watch for inspiration for Silverstreak, I was trying to watch Chyna's career while I was going to make sure I wasn't giving her too much of a win all the time, or having her like beat down and have this miraculous reversal where she wins the day doing it. So in both ways, wrestling kind of came in for me there.
So we'll start with Rick and ask Samo and Anthony as well. Over, the last couple of decades, comics and wrestling have both evolved in ways that probably never could have been foreseen with the internet and things of that nature. How have you seen over the years those two industries change in similar ways? And what is this like? Can you speak to a reason behind it? Like, is there a commonality behind the ebb and the flow, the rising tide in popularity in both comics and pro wrestling?
Well, for comics and wrestling, it's both more of a melodrama than a, you know what I mean, where everything's over the top. Everything is exaggerated. The bodies of the superheroes are all big and muscular like the wrestlers, and and everything is done so the person in the last row can see it if you're watching wrestling and understand what's going on. And with superheroes, it's never they have a minor problem that you or I would have during the day. Their problems are all earth-shattering, and it's all very big and bold. And society has gone in that way in general. I mean, you look at everything in TV, it's all more, there's very little subtlety left. When I was a kid, I liked the Pink Panther movies. And my son liked the Steve Martin movie, and when we tried to watch the Peter Sellers ones, the jokes were very far apart, and I didn't realize that because I had grown up. And everyone wants things faster and bigger, and that's what superheroes and wrestling have been doing for a long time. And society just kind of moved in that direction. And so it kind of fills a void. And they've gotten better at the athleticism in the wrestling. They've gotten better at the storytelling to a large degree. And comics have started taking themselves more seriously too, with longer stories, and they're writing to put it in trade paperbacks instead of single issues. Because when I was a kid, you bought one issue of a DC comic, you could skip it for 6 months, pick up another issue, and it didn't matter that you missed it for 6 months. It was at Marvel where if you missed one issue and picked up the next, you have no clue what was going on because they did a soap opera type story. But even TV shows, you see something like Breaking Bad, where the story progresses over the whole series, or The Walking Dead, and they kill off characters. It's all become more soap opera-like and more, more one big story instead of little stories. Sort of like Kingston does, where his character just runs forever and grows and changes from the beginning to the end instead of just little bits here and there.
Emma, we've seen kind of a shift. I don't know if some people, I guess in comics, maybe date it back on a mainstream level to Watchmen. I don't know how far back you would date it in pro wrestling, but there was a change of sorts from like the apple pie kind of straightforward, super good guy, super bad guy, the advent of the anti-hero, these complex characters. In wrestling, we saw that move away from, Hulk Hogan, the great Boy Scout, to something more confusing with the NWO and Steve Austin. In comics, was there a change in that direction along a similar lines where
that was the Punisher?
Was that the Punisher, or was it dependent on? Was it dependent on the company? Because it seemed like DC kind of held on a little bit to that cookie cutter good guy, that straightforward, Boy Scout, whereas like the Punisher, you're pointing out, like these darker characters were more in favor. We saw that also in wrestling. Where Samo, did you see the merge of that happen in wrestling and in comics?
The merger itself?
Not the merger of it necessarily, but like the overlapping of
like the time frame?
The move in that direction, yeah.
Because if it was comics itself, I'd agree with Rick. It was Punisher, and then when Speedy became a junkie with Green Lantern and Green Arrow, and the story started to shift that way, and Batman got darker again. But I would say late 80s, early 90s. I mean, the NWA was always darker than the WWF. Hogan and New York was very much DC Comics. Superman, the good Cowboys wore the white hats, the bad Cowboys wore the black hats, but the NWA always had that gray area. You had the Four Horsemen. These were guys that you were supposed to hate, but you were kind of envious of them. You had the Midnight Express, like you hated these guys, but you couldn't deny how talented they were. You had the glorified Rock and Roll Express that were the ultra baby faces, but there was something about Ricky Morton that you just wanted to kick him in the head. So the NWA always had that darker tone to it, a little more realism. Although I think Josh and I talked about this one time a long time ago how nobody, we realized that nobody called the cops when the Four Horsemen jumped Dusty Rhodes at a gas station. The camera crew was just there recording it and nobody noticed. But for comics, I'd say it was Dark Horse and Image that really turned the page. So I'd say, early 90s before the NWO is when the crossover started happening. Comics went darker, the Batman movie came out, The Crow comic came out, Mask came out. So that was the impetus of it all.
Okay, here's a fun one for you, Anthony. So, I just completely went blank. It's too early in the morning for me with no coffee. So what Samo was just talking about as far as that kind of switch towards things darker, I don't know if you'd say darker or more realistic, was Tully Blanchard the first cool villain in wrestling, do you think? And are we looking back at what Rick said with the Punisher, and are we seeing it? Was that the first time there was like a cool villain in comics?
Yeah, I mean, Tully Blanchard was definitely the first, if not one of the first, if not the first, kind of quote unquote cool bad guy. That was a little farther back than I go. The bad guy that was so cool that I gravitated towards was Austin. I mean, I'm only 34, so as a teenager, I started getting into the anti-heroes. Earlier than that, I was all about the baby faces. I wanted the good guys to win, the bad guys to lose. That was the end of that. But now that I'm older and I can go back with the network and YouTube and stuff like that, they did it so much better back in the day. I gotta say. Yeah, I mean, as far as the kind of the turning of the tide where the good guys became cool, or the good guys became bad guys and the bad guys became cool. I mean, just WrestleMania 13, that's the one that stands out in my mind. The double turn with Bret Hart and Stone Cold. I mean, that was like the paradigm shift, at least in my kind of age bracket.
Okay. I got back my thought from earlier, so I'll throw this at you and then open it up. Samo, Rick, whoever Mike wants to throw in. One thing that comics and pro wrestling have shared over the years is that they've been reflective of what's going on in society. I think Samo touched on this a little bit. Francis may have touched on this a little bit. Like in wrestling, you had the Soviets were the bad guys during the Cold War, dating back even further than that. In comics, you had, Captain America fighting Nazis, things of that nature. Does that still work today? Does that still work as far as those mediums? Pro wrestling, is that part of what people maybe sense has been lost a little bit? Is that there's a disconnect now with people who are growing up potentially reading comics and not being able to relate to them? Or does it even exist in pro wrestling anymore where anything we're watching on TV is reflective of what's going on in the world? Can you even do that now without it being, considered co-opting some sort of tragedy that's going on in the world, or nationalism or something like that?
No, because everyone wants to be offended for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Like, we'll go back to WrestleMania 21 when Muhammad Hassan was out there, and then he brought his minions and whatever else, and unfortunately there was a bombing, but guys were dressed similarly, and then boom, Muhammad Hassan's character was dropped instantly. Like, bye-bye, we never knew you. And I made mention that my family was from the Middle East, so it didn't offend me that Muhammad Hassan was a character that was a sympathizer, because there are people that are actual sympathizers. You hear about those sleeper cells and whatever else, but I don't think we can go to the extent of having Iron Sheik come out and wave the Iranian flag anymore. I don't think we can have the Bolsheviks come out singing the Soviet national anthem. Colonel De Beers would never fly today. character that was pro-apartheid or anything of that sort. Even Fritz von Erich was like a Nazi sympathizer and then somehow dropped his accent and became Texas hero.
I think it's a larger issue, not even just the offensive part of it. Like, wrestling and comics are both such industries now. Like, they seem like they just market to their – it's like a snake eating its tail. I mean, particularly in comics, but you market to the same fan base over and over again. And I think, like, it's almost like – I mean, wrestling now is just inspired by old wrestling to the point that, like, you can see – like, it drives me nuts when you have characters that do moves from other wrestlers as, like, a tribute that doesn't fit their character.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I like that sort of thing drives me nuts. Like, you know what I mean? I hate to say, like, use a term that Jim Cornette uses because he drives me nuts, but cosplay wrestling, I mean, there's a lot of tribute acts out there, and there's not a lot of originality. I mean, for a period of time, I remember watching the TNA match, and you had, you know, the guy that was doing Scott Steiner's gimmick versus the guy that was doing Steve Austin's gimmick versus the guy that was doing, I don't even know. There was like Jay Lethal was doing Randy Savage, like Jay Lethal versus Shark Boy versus P. Williams, and they were all just doing somebody else's gimmick. And you kind of see that now a little bit. Like, wrestling used to engage with pop culture more. Like, to me, like, in the Attitude Era, like, when, I don't know, like, it was a big thing for like a day when Tom Cruise or Justin Bieber challenged Tom Cruise to fight or something, or on Twitter, like, somebody like Drake Maverick should have been out there cutting a promo on that. You know what I mean? And like inserting himself into it. Like, but now it's just like this, the WWE universe is everything, and everything has to, I don't know, every wrestler has to grow up to be a fan of it. Like, it's just too, like I said, it's a snake eating its tail. And comic, they're just marketing to comic fans and solely to other fans. And some of that is a function of the business having so much of a, Marvel and DC having so much of a market share, and WWE having obviously so much of a market share. Like, trying to, something just makes sense business-wise. But I think that to me is what's lost. I don't necessarily think you have to have foreign heels or whatever, but I think there are ways that you can engage with popular and make your product more relevant than just have, you know, Drew McIntyre and Baron Corbin fight it out for the, 4 weeks in a row.
I think that what we're missing is any real heat. I think everyone is so offended, and so the corporations are so afraid to offend anyone that they've taken all the fun out of it, because that was part of the fun, was the offensiveness. I mean, the best comics were very offensive. Watchmen was very offensive at the time it came out. The NWO was extremely offensive. The Attitude Era was extremely offensive. People in the media were talking about how offended they were, and they never had a larger audience. And now that they're scared to offend anyone, they never had a smaller audience.
I was just going to say, after what Mike just said, I was going to say, did you think that there was a problem with not being able to provoke an audience with a character or with a storyline to truly be angry and hate a bad guy, like to get that kind of emotional reaction without? Is it just a matter of not being good at it anymore right now? Like, that's a broad stroke, but because you should be able to touch that button, right, without, But
this is going to sound like some, I don't know. I mean, people might take it the wrong way, I guess, or whatever, but like, why does it always have to be a foreign bad guy? Like, why can't we get behind why can't we have a, Puerto Rican babyface to, like in boxing? Like, I mean, I've been in New York City after Miguel Cotto fights, and like people are just pouring out into the streets and they're excited. You know what I mean? People used to tune in for Pedro Morales. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, whatever, it's considered ethnic baby faces or whatnot, but I mean, why not have characters that people can be proud of to maybe, tune in instead? Why does it always have to be the foreign heel that everybody misses? And I get it, they're fun characters. I mean, those Iron Sheik and Nikolai Volkov were in the first match I ever watched, but I think it's just about pivoting, doing something different, I guess, and instead of being like, hey, we can't do this anymore, it sucks, well, then that's great, but we got to do something different.
But didn't they try that with We the People? Like they tried to go that whole, super right-wing American patriotic thing that was bordering racism with Dutch Mantel.
And it got over.
Right, but then they had to they had to they got too much heat or whatever and had to cut the cord on it and say, hey, we're actors and we're just playing a part.
Yeah.
That's actually what I noticed between comics and wrestling. The real crossover is that anytime there's a story arc that's going and they change writers, automatically, matches are changed for pay-per-views or stories are completely changed. And then in comics, when they change the writer on the book in the middle of the series, Superman has jockey shorts again on the outside of his costume. Well, we'll forget that story arc, even though we have 3 issues left to finish it off. We used to have the maxi series of 12 issues to tell a full story crossover in comics, in that it was the slow burn for over a year. And then pay-per-view builds were a slow burn for like a year and a half. Like, it got set up, I'm just going to pick the 80s, for example. So it got set up at, WrestleMania in 1986, and we didn't get the payoff till like WrestleMania in 1988. And now we just have, it's like, oh, well, Fastlane is Sunday. So from Fastlane, what's the one after Fastlane? Oh, that one's going to be SummerSlam. All right, so we'll build up this whole feud in 3 weeks leading up to SummerSlam. Okay, from SummerSlam, what's after that? I don't know. Whatever there is, build up 3 weeks to that. Like, there's no slow burn. There's no emotional investment in it anymore. And I think
back in the Hogan era, they had a process where like Hogan's feuding with the guy and they're building a guy behind him.
Yeah.
So you kind of know like the guy that's feuding with Jim Duggan is going to be feuding with Hogan next, and the guy that's feuding with Tito Santana is going to be feuding with Jim Duggan, and it was like a process that you could follow. And like the thing is that the Hogan method still works, but the baby faces are so much bigger. Like Braun Strowman as a baby face is laughable because the only good dynamic you have left is big man, little man. So like it hurt Cena for being so big when he's beating up Rey Mysterio and people don't care. But like Cena versus Umaga and Khali both worked very well and people responded well to them. And I mean, who had a good match with Khali? But Cena had a good match with Khali. You know what I mean? Like the dynamic works, but some of it is the in wrestling at least, the guys have changed physically, and that hurts somewhat.
What about heat though? Like it doesn't have, like you were saying, it doesn't have to be foreign characters or things like that, but can you really piss off an audience these days, whether it's in comics or in wrestling? Is there a real hated, loathsome bad guy in comics or in wrestling, Francis?
What about MJF? He seems to be one of the people who stays in character outside, but the hard part is, have we pulled back the curtain so much that people go, MJF called me a mother effer. That's funny. That's great because he hates me, but I know he doesn't really hate me. It's a character. So have we just gone too far back that we need to like close the curtain again and then refresh, or is it like, I don't know how you can put it.
I hate to keep bringing up his name, but Jim Cornette's probably the only real heel in wrestling.
That's funny because to me he's a huge baby face. I don't know what that says about me.
But that's so like ROH exploited that. They had one of their most successful feuds when it was ROH versus CZW, because CZW has its fans and ROH has its fans, and they had a crazy successful run off of that. And you could probably do something like that, you know what I mean, these days, with fans of different types of wrestling. If you had deathmatch wrestlers or whatever, you know what I mean? Like you could do something with different styles of wrestling. Maybe the cruiserweights or whatever want to prove that they're worth, and maybe you could get people invested that way. But I mean, it's really, really hard to generate it based on storyline, and particularly too, because none of the wrestlers want to stay invested either. They've got their real names on their Twitter handles, and people tweet at them in character, and then they're like, "Oh, don't tweet at me in character." And like Punk had heat because Punk was Punk. I mean, he, as a human being, he drew heat. So, but he stayed in character, and that helps. But, you know what I mean? A lot of it feels like the wrestlers don't want the heat.
But doesn't it feel like most of the wrestlers don't believe their character? Like Seth Rollins doing this whole Monday Night Messiah worship me thing. It doesn't come across as believable. Like MJF, the way Francis said it, you believe MJF is that guy. When I see Seth Rollins trying to do his, Monday Night Messiah, I'm the greatest thing, he doesn't believe the words that are coming out of his mouth. So if he doesn't believe it, how am I going to believe it?
It also feels like it's just a reheated version of CM Punk's whole stick when he was he had his disciples.
Strange Society, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that comics and wrestling are going to have more in common moving forward with the state of both industries right now. And it's a good time. Might not have been in 2007, but it's a good time right now to be a Michael Kingston. It's all going to be about the independents for quite some time, I think. Guys, we're going to wrap it up here. I'm going to go down the line one more time. Give me your last thoughts on how comic storytelling and wrestling storytelling has affected your fandom or affected your process. And while you're at it, put over your social media, tell everybody where they can find you and what you're working on right now. Anthony Bench.
My social media is This Game Cheats on Twitter. That's the only one that I like people I don't know following. As far as some last thoughts, I harped on this for years, but going back to what you guys were saying about, how do you be a bad guy in this day and age? One of the things I miss so much, watching wrestling is you have this character and you're rooting behind him and you want him to succeed. And I know there's a delicate balance to this, but I want to see a bad guy who believably stands in the way of the good guy's goal. Whether it be a championship, whether it be some other accolade, like I want a bad guy to pose a threat to that goal. It just seems like, month after month, it's a new pay-per-view, it's a new feud. There's no residual overlap. There's no continuity. I think that's a lost art. And granted, if you prolong that success, if you have somebody chasing the championship for months and months and months, and he gets screwed every month, every week, just over and over and over again, that does get old, and it kind of, I guess, steals the hope from the audience. So there is a balance to it, but I don't see it in wrestling these days, and that's really, really unfortunate.
Flobo Boyce.
It's very easy to get down on pro wrestling now, especially people my age in their mid-30s. But as someone that has to cover it weekly, I can tell you the game has changed. So as much as I remember the days of year-long builds, you got maybe Saturday night's main event and maybe a pay-per-view. Every week I cover Raw, NXT. I don't cover SmackDown. There was 205 Alive, NXT, NXT UK, and that's just the E. And just like comics, the whole game has changed there too. We used to go down to the corner and read our book, and we know exactly what's going on with Superman's life. But DC has Instagram takeovers. There's a movie continuity. There's the animated series continuity. Things move much faster, and it has to keep up with that. So a lot of people my age and older sit there and we lament about how wrestling is, but it's only doing what pop culture is doing. We have less and less attention span, more than everything else. We don't believe in true heat anymore. It's either I like this guy or it's go away heat, right? Let's be honest with ourselves. We love the sport, we love the art, but there's ways we can improve it. My name is Flobo Boyce. You can follow me at Twitter at Flobo Boyce or on Instagram at Flobito and Flobito.com. And if you want to support the homie, you can sign up for the Patreon, patreon.com/Flobo Boyce. New content is there every week.
And check out his podcast, New Amsterdam, as well as the backlog of the greatest podcast, the 26 Stone
That's
podcast.
not!
Rik Offenberger.
Hi, I'm Rik Offenberger. You can find me at firstcomicsnews.com, where we do a pop culture website that covers comics and wrestling. And then I've got a publishing venture, G-Man Comics. It's g-man-comics.com. And we're doing fanzines at the moment, but we will have a Kickstarter with all new comics coming out later this year. And I really say that comics and wrestling need to embrace more creativity and more new ideas. It's you don't win by doing a retro show for the fans you have. You win by having new ideas that bring new people in because they're so powerful. And I think both mediums are missing that at the moment. And I don't think they took advantage of the downtime from the COVID to come up with new and more creative ideas. And I think they have to work on that.
Robert Samo.
Fanboynation.com, fangirlnation.com, Twitter and Instagram, Fanboy Nation. Twitter for Fangirl Nation is FGN Mag. Instagram is FGN Magazine. Pro wrestling, it has moved. I think, like Francis said, we pulled the curtain too far back to the point that I think Wrestling Society X was ahead of its time, and Lucha Underground, if they had the funding, could have been the future of professional wrestling, because with MMA, at its peak, that was the only way for professional wrestling to go, was the level of Lucha Underground. Comics, we got Webtoons, we got Marvel, we got DC, and they're selling their stuff direct. We got the indie books. I think it's going to be a lot of creator-owned stuff. I think, like what Josh said, it's going to be a lot of indie stuff. It's going to be a lot of AEW, where Hangman Page runs 125 yards across the field to get into the brawl at a pay-per-view and then be gassed out by the end of it. So it's going to be that kind of stuff that's going to be coming from now on.
Francis.
Let's see. For the Massacre Twins, you can go to the Massacre Twins on Instagram. I'm starting to update that again. Personal is Viva La Franzig on Instagram, and also Viva La Fran on Twitter, which is just Viva_La_Fran, and there's a lot of Overwatch videos on there if you're into that. I think what you said, Josh, it's going to be the time of the independents, especially right now. What's going on? People have more time to explore, and hopefully they'll see a different perspective of not just Batman, Superman, Iron Man, all Avengers. It's going to be something where, comics can be this, comics can be that. And Michael Kingston brought up earlier, like, I love Road to Perdition. I didn't know for the longest time that it was a graphic novel. So, it's going to be a time for more people to explore and hopefully have a more open mind. But as far as storytelling goes, like Flobo said too, I'm starting to be a tribute act. Don't say like Rick said. But like, it's going to be hard because we are shifting to a different attention spans and different tastes. And, we at the same time, we could bring back some of that old kind of storytelling, but we have to find that new way to do it.
Michael Kingston.
You can find me everywhere on headlockcomic.com, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, the whole 9 yards. I have a Kickstarter going till July 27th for Headlock Tales from the Road, which is 13 stories co-created by different wrestlers. We have Samoa Joe, MVP, the Young Bucks, Dolph Ziggler, Christian, Taya, Mustafa Ali. So a bunch of different stories, all different genres. And it's a lot of fun. And we're giving people the opportunity to be created as a wrestler in the Headlock universe by Jill Thompson, Ed McGuinness, and Lauren Moran, which I think are really cool. And we have the opportunity for people to be drawn on the cover. So we got some cool stuff. As far as the future, it's really hard to know. I mean, the world is changing like every minute, and it's really hard to know how everything's going to land. And it's kind of hard as an independent to navigate that in real time. I mean, cons were most of my business, and now, I'm got pretty wiped out this year just by not having shows. So, I got to find something different. So we do stuff like this. I mean, do virtual panels, Kickstarter, whatever. But it's whoever pivots in the right way the first is probably going to be positioned best to succeed. I do think, like you said, it's the independents, just because it's not as unwieldy of a ship to turn around, but everybody's going to have to make some moves to survive in the future.
It's a time of great change, but also a time of great opportunity. Guys, thanks for joining us here. Appreciate you guys getting up early and doing this for me. San Diego Comic-Con 2021. Hopefully we'll all be doing this in the same room again together. Thank you all for joining and watching us. Make sure to follow all these wonderful, interesting people that joined us here today for you. My name is Joshua Waldrop. You can find me at SoCal Franchise with the ZE at the end. All social media. Look for Red Guerrilla, Guerrilla. That's a whole bunch of comedy, a whole bunch of different stuff that'll be coming up soon. Remember, we're all in this together. Be an ally. Black Lives Matter. And we miss you, Shad Gaspard. Thanks again, and have a great day.
That was fun, man. Thanks.
Yeah, good.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, good time.